Okay, so I was just saying that the very first teaching in Pirkei Avos, after it gives you the order of the transmission of the Torah, is the teachings of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So I just mentioned this is the body that Ezra was miyased at the beginning of the Bayis Sheni, shortly after the building of the Beis Hamikdash, second Bayis, and they made many takanas, many gezeres, the nuschais of tefillah, come from the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. So the question simply is, what is the relationship of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah to the Sanhedrin, which is 71? This is 120. So the Rambam is masbir that when the Sanhedrin is 71, the Chachamim have a kayach, presumably the Sanhedrin has a kayach, to be marchiv the body, to include other Chachamim when there's a need for a consensus, there's a need to get other Gedolim, so to speak, on board. So, Einochinami. So according to the Rambam, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah included the 71 members of the Sanhedrin plus additional Chachamim, and that was at Tzarech Hasha. The raya to the Rambam's Yesait, and the Rambam brings this raya, is the well-known klal that when the Sanhedrin makes a takana, so it says, Ein beis and yochel levatel divrei beis and chaverei elim kein gadol mimenu b'chachma v'minyan, that when a Sanhedrin makes a takana, a later Sanhedrin cannot be mevatel it unless they are greater in wisdom and greater in number. So the Rambam says, greater in wisdom, even though it's not likely because Nishkatnu Adoros, but theoretically, if the later Sanhedrin is greater in wisdom, that's Gadol B'chachma. But frek the Rambam, how is it Shaykh to be Gadol B'minyan if the maximum of a Sanhedrin is 71? So the Rambam brings a Raya Taka that the Sanhedrin can in fact be expanded. So it would be Shaykh that the earlier Sanhedrin was 71, and the later Sanhedrin, like Ezra's time, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, it's 120, so that would satisfy the minyan qualification, and Gadol B'chachma would depend on the Metzias, is it Gadol B'chachma? Of course, Gadol B'chachma is a little hard to measure as well. I mean, do we mean if anybody, I mean, you have a lot of people, right? And by definition, you have more than 71 people to make the minyan thing. So is Gadol B'chachma an average? You kind of measure, however you measure it. The average Chacham is greater, the individual Chacham is greater, the majority of Chachamim are greater than that majority. I don't even know b'diuk how you would even measure something of Gadol B'chachma, but okay, this is the klal. So they made many takanas and gezeras, but apparently they didn't replace anybody, meaning to say somebody died, so you have 119 now, and that's why we could talk about Shimon HaTzadik is the last surviving member of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Now, how can you be a last surviving member if every time there was a vacancy, there was a new appointment, there wouldn't be a last surviving member? The answer is they didn't replace. And as Ezra understood that this was a special miyuchadika body for a limited amount of time, and as people died, and Shimon HaTzadik was indeed the very last person, survivor, of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. The Rambam writes that Shimon HaTzadik, and you see it from Pirkei Avos really, is actually considered to be the first Tana. He is the earliest Tana that's mentioned in the Mishnah, or to put it another way, a new Tekufa began from the time of Shimon HaTzadik. Now, the Rambam writes in the Hakdama to the Mishnah Torah that Shimon HaTzadik became the Kohen Gadol after the death of Ezra. Now the emes is, that's also a little bit of a pella, because the Rambam is therefore telling me Ezra was a Kohen Gadol. Now Ezra was a Kohen, that's for sure. In fact, in Sefer Ezra, it gives you the whole yichus of Ezra, all the way to Pinchas, Elazar, and HaRav. So Pinchas is a Kohen miyuchas for many generations. But if you read Tanakh, he's not the Kohen Gadol. I mean, there is another man who was designated as Kohen Gadol, Yeshua ben Yehitzadak. In fact, Ezra did not come to Eretz Yisrael till after the Beis Hamikdash was built. He came 1 year afterwards. And one of the reasons that's given is he didn't want to kind of take over, because he was the greatest, he was the Gadol Hador. He didn't want to take anything away from Yeshua ben Yehitzadak at the very beginning. So when did Ezra become Kohen Gadol? It's a bit of a mystery, but the Rambam apparently learns that after Yeshua ben Yitzchak died, Ezra became Kohen Gadol. Now, that actually makes a lot of sense for the following reason. Yeshua ben Yitzchak's sons actually married non-Jewish women. This was a source of great busha. So in Mela, it makes a lot of sense, but that although normally the Kahuna Gedaila goes to your son, it's a hereditary office, it wasn't Shaykh in this situation. In Mela, they went to the Gadol Hador, which was Ezra. So these are the Anshe Knesses Hagdaila. Now, they said three things. Again, just remember their three teachings. Be Masunin Badin, Masunin Badin. Masunin, to be matun, is to be deliberate. Don't rush. Think through things very carefully. And that's referring both to theoretical limud. When you learn, don't rush. Take your time. That's not the same thing as kvetching, but this is going with understanding pshat. Be sure you understand. Even if you're just learning Gemara and Rashi. Right? People create a false dichotomy between Eon and Bekias. Right? So Eon is I look at every parish, every Rishon, and Bekias is they say I daven up. The truth is, the expression davening up is really a very, very sad expression, because what does it mean? When you want to describe superficial, unthinking recitation with no Havana, we call that davening. You know, what does it say about our davening, right? But whatever. But the expression is taka benimtza, davening up. Yeah, it's such a chaval. That's the description that we use, davening up. So you have extremes. Eon is this extreme, and Bekias is that extreme. But Rabbi Yashiv says, he actually said, there aren't two ways of learning. There's only one way of learning. And whatever you learn, you try to understand. So even in what you call Bekias, where you're learning fewer things, you're learning Gemara and Rashi even. Good. That means you still have to understand the pshat. You know, Rashi was a Rishon too. And as they say, you know, number one, Rashi didn't have Taisus when he learned. Rashi didn't even have Rashi when he learned. Like says, so what was Rashi's learning bigger? Rashi learning bigger is learned Gemara. I mean, there were a few things. Rashi had. Rashi did. It's not the pshat that Rashi didn't have anything before, but it was very little. It really was very little. So Rashi is concentrating on the Gemara, itself. You concentrate on the Gemara. So Masunin Badin is a reference to taking your time to be sure you understand the din, and that's true in learning, and it's true in Psak Halacha. The second is to have many, many Talmidim, be marbitz Torah to whatever degree that you can. And the third is, and this was a great principle for the Anshe Knesset Agdela, to make fences around the Torah, because to understand that just as the Gemara says by a Nazir should not go into a vineyard. Now, a Nazir is allowed to go into a vineyard. There's no Isser for a Nazir to go into a vineyard. Elamai, you get too close to the grapes, you might pick one. So a person has to make a siyag. Now, we have siyagim that are the gezeres of Chazal. That's a very familiar thing. Don't do this, lest you come to do that, right? That's what a gezerah is. But the truth is, in Avodas Hashem also, you have to have your own harchakas. Don't put yourself in compromising places. Don't put yourself where you're likely, or there's a strong possibility, or even maybe a small possibility, that you might be influenced in a bad way. So you see, in other words, the three directives, on one hand, are referring to the institution of the Anshe. In other words, it's almost their own mission statement. We have to be careful in our psak. We have to be ma'imid talmidim harbe. We have to make siyagim latayra. Right? This was the mission statement of the Anshe Knesset Agdela. So they're referring to their own avodah, but it also applies to a yachid. Right? It applies to the Gedolei Hador, who are manig the door. It also applies to a yachid in his own avodas Hashem. So here I want to read a little bit from the Nefesh Chaim Mamish, and he brings the Gemara in Shabbos. This is Shabbos Lamed Aleph Amid Aleph, on the pasuk Yiras Hashem Hi Oitzarai. Yiras Hashem is a person's Eitzer. Now, Eitzer sometimes means treasure, but the drush of Chazal is that an Eitzer is not a treasure, it is a warehouse or a storehouse that protects the treasure. And the Gemara says, Mashal lama davar daima. So, halali korchitim lialiyah. I tell the guy, I bought wheat from you. So I say, bring up a core. Core is a large measure of wheat. In my aliyah, put it in my upper story. Halach v'helalei. So the mocher transported, or the workers transported the chitim to my aliyah. Amarle, I then say to the worker, or to the seller, whoever did it, Iravtali bahen kav chumtin. Did you mix with the wheat a kav? A kav is a small measure. We'll see if Chaim will be medayik on the ratio here of soil. Again, there was Chazal basically say that anything that grows, any vegetation, any grain, it is naturally preserved if you put a little bit of the soil in which it grew from. That has the nutrients. So even though it's already tolush, it's already harvested, but it will get the nutrients from that soil. So, were you ma'arev, a kav of that dirt in the chitim? So the person said, lo, I didn't put, I just gave you the wheat, I didn't give you the dirt. So the lokeach said, mutav imlo helisa. It would have been better had you not brought the wheat up, because without the dirt, the wheat is not going to get preserved, and the wheat is going to spoil, and memela. So what does the Gemara say? Yiras Hashem hi oitzarei. Yiras Hashem is that which preserves the Torah that you learn. The Torah is compared to the core chitim. The Yiras Hashem, which is Musar or work thinking about Devekos, that is considered to be the kav chumtin. And the same way, without the kav chumtin, the core of chitim is going to spoil. So without Yiras Hashem, hi oitzarei, the Torah that you learn is not going to remain with you. That means you'll forget it, and also it's not going to elevate you. It's not going to purify you. You have to have Yiras Hashem as the preservative. Now, why we're using slightly different mishalim, it's not clear to me, because there are two different mishalim here. I mean, the meaning is the same, that it's Yiras Hashem that preserves your Torah. But one mashal is, it's like the dirt that you mix with the chitim. The other, which is actually the lesson of the pasuk, is it's the Eitzar, it's the warehouse. Without the warehouse, you have animals or ganavim. So both are making the same point, that the Yiras Hashem preserves the chitim, but it's actually using two different mishalim. In other words, the mashal the Gemara gives is not the mashal the pasuk uses. In other words, the Gemara says, what is the meaning of the pasuk Yiras Hashem hi oitzarei? So it gives the mashal of the kav chutbin in the kor chitim. I would have said a different thing. I would have said, I would have made a mashal that's exactly like the pasuk says. Mashal the Adam who put chitim, and then I said, oh, is there a fence around the chitim? Did you lock the door? Is it in a safe place? And if you would have said no, I would have said, it would be better not to even bring it at all, because it's going to get lost. Animals are going to eat it. It's going to get trampled on. So that's a HaRav. Rav Chaim does not go in this, and I don't have a pshat either. Why the Gemara changes the tziyur of the preservation from the lesson of the pasuk. But be it as it may, what Rav Chaim is going to address is the concept that Yiras Hashem is the Eitzar, like Eitzar HaChachma. It is the preservative of the Chachma. Without Yiras Hashem, the Torah is not going to have a kiyum in you, and that both means in terms of forgetting it, Pashat Pshuta Kamashmai, but it also means even deeper than forgetting it. I mean, you can have an apikaris who may have a real photographic memory. He won't forget the Torah, although maybe he still might, but it primarily refers to the impact of the Torah Hashem on your neshama. It requires Yiras Hashem. So here, Rav Chaim, and then Derech Agav, the Gemara Taka brings a halacha lemaisa, a Tanad Rabbi Yishmael, Ma'arev Adam kav chunvin b'kor shel tvua v'yeino chayshish. This is indeed the halacha, that if I have a contract that you're supposed to give me a core of chitim, you could be ma'arev, you should be ma'arev, that proportion of a kav in the core, and that's not called mekachtois for kippun. I actually want that to happen, meaning a certain amount of dirt or pebbles or rocks can be more of with the tefillah. That's a din in Chayshin Mishpah. So here, Rav Chaim says a tremendous, interesting ratio. How much time do you spend? Right? So Yiras Hashem is, he doesn't say b'diak what it is, but it seems to be musar, thinking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, deveikus, thinking about your chayv in the world. And he says, let's look at the ratio here. What's the Eitzer and what's the Yikr? So first of all, you see Klor, that you don't spend the whole day learning Musar, because Musar is said to be the preservative of the Torah. So this is fascinating. So here's this ratio, quite amazing. A kav of the dirt to a core of the chitim. So let's just do the math here. A core is 30 saw. These are volume measurements. A saw is 6 kavim. So 1 kav is 1 part in 180, meaning a core is 180 times more than a kav. So Rav Chaim says that means 180th of your time should be devoted to the musar. The learning should be 180 times more than the musar. And Rav Chaim says, in a 15-hour day, this will amount to 5 minutes. That is correct, really. 15 hours, right? Huh?
Should we hold it?
Sure. Okay. So I see right now in the footnote, although he doesn't bring a mucker for this, but in the footnote he says, this was B'daris Harishainim. Although he doesn't bring a makar for that. B'daris Harishainim were strong. They were filled with Yiras Hashem, so they needed just a little oomph, a little bit of musar to strengthen them. We taka need more, and hakol lefi ha'inyan b'hazman b'hamakam b'hatalmud. So we don't work with these numbers. We don't work with these numbers. But it's interesting. Rav Chaim Mamish took this as a very literal ratio that he applied. But the main point that he made is still the main point. And in the Nefesh HaChaim, you may recall, he's marich in this a lot. He says a lot of people spend the whole day, they say Tehillim, which is a wonderful feeling of Deveikus Hashem. And the like, he's really talking about Hasidim. He calls them Avakshei Hashem. He's very derech eretz. He does not use Lashonos of Bizayon towards Hasidim. In fact, in that way, he was frankly different than his Rebbe. The Gra used very, very strong negative terms. Rav Chaim B'davka did not talk that way, and in fact, it's interesting when the Gra put a cherem against early Hasidus. Many Rabbanim signed, because the Gra, Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who's already the Rav of Volozhin, did not sign the ban against Hasidus, and it's a bit of a kasha. So Rav Chaim himself said that it's not covetic for the Gra that he should sign the Gra's cherem as if the Gra needed his haskama. So the Mele is not going to sign because he's not someone who has to kind of be maskim to what his Rebbe did. That's what Rav Chaim said. But the Emes says, many say that, although it's hard to say such a thing, that Rav Chaim was not totally maskim to the gisha of the Gra. All of the tainas the Gra had, Rav Chaim had too, and he says in the Nefesh HaChaim, there weren't machshav learning enough, whatever it would be. But he felt that the way you deal with them is by kiruv and by openness and by friendship, and not by harshness, because the harshness is likely to drive people away, and chas v'shalom they could become more pirates getter. So in Volozhin, there were many Hasidic Talmidim who learned in Volozhin, and they say in Rav Yitzchak of Volozhin's library, in the son of Rav Chaim, there are Sifrei Hasidus that he learned. Of course, Lubavitcher Rebbe claims that Rav Chaim Volozhiner in the Nefesh HaChaim was mushpa by the Tanya. He says because Tanya came out a little early. I don't know if that's true, but the Chalapachas, the two Svarim, have a lot in common. Uh, so Rav Chaim had a different attitude towards this, but in the Nefesh HaChaim, he does talk about the idea that you always have. In fact, the same thought he's saying here, Bekitzer. He says there be arichos, and that is Yiras Hashem and Devekos is very, very important, but it is the preservative of the grain that is the Torah, and therefore it should only be a portion of the day. It should not be your Ikar day, because once you have the Yiras Hashem, the Torah itself connects you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Torah itself, and indeed that's Rav Chaim Shita. Rav Chaim Shita in Shar Dalet of Nefesh HaChaim is that everything you learn in Torah, right? This is a kasha people always have. And again, I would have to say that a Baal Tshuva may, or someone who's new to learning Gemara, will have this question especially. Okay, you guys don't have that anymore, but maybe you had it at one time. And that is, people come to Ohr Somayach or wherever they come, and they hear that in Gemara, Talmud is the secret of life, the purpose of existence. Why did God create the world? Why did God create me? What is my mission in life? Gemara will tell you this. So you come to your first Gemara share, you never learned Gemara before, and you're very, very excited. I'm finally going to understand what is the tachlis of my life. So all of a sudden, the Sefer gets opened, and it's, okay, two guys are holding a talis, and they come, or a chicken laid an egg on Yom Tov. Now maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. If you're a legalistic person, you like complicated discussions, you'll like it. If you're not that type of personality, you're not going to like it. But ben kach u ben kach, even if you like it, what's my mission of life? What is it? Now, what's the tachlis of Bria? Why did God make the world? How does this tell me that? It's a good kasha. It's a good kasha. So what would Rav Chaim Volozhiner say? He says in Nefesh HaChaim, all of that is happening, but it's not happening necessarily on a conscious level. It's happening on the neshama level, which then leaks out into your conscious metzias. And that is, since the Torah is the Ratzon Hashem, and the Ratzon Hashem is the same as the essence of Hashem, because in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with a human being, we could be mechalek. I'm different things. I have a hand, I have an arm, I have a torso, I have a mind, I have a will. And you can separate the will from the person. But the Eibishter is called Achdus HaPashut. Achdus HaPashut means an Achdus that's a simple, meaning indivisible unity. We don't know what that means even. I say the words. It's not that Hashem has a hand. Rather, that everything in Hashem is only one Achdus. So Memela, if the Torah is the Ratzain Hashem, when I am mechaber myself to the Ratzain Hashem, I am mechaber myself to Hashem. That's the meaning of the Zayar. Kudsha B'richu V'Yaraisa Chato. The Torah and Hashem are one because the Ratzain is the same as the Metzias. Memela, Rav Chaim says, it makes no difference what you are learning. It makes no difference if it's Kachim or Tyrus or Shnayim Eichlin or Cheskas Habatim. Even things that seemingly have nothing to do with Ruchnius. They're not Ruchniistika in Yonim. You're learning about Ganovim, and you're learning about adultery, and you're learning about all sorts of Ritzicha, all sorts of things that are really fakert from the Torah even. But you're learning the Ratzon Hashem. What is the Ratzon Hashem? Torah Shabbal Peh. So that was Rav Chaim's Yesod. Rav Chaim's Yesod is that Torah itself is mechaber you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's really nothing else you need except you need to make yourself a kli to be able to be makabel that Torah. You need to create an eitzar, a warehouse, a preservative. And that's where some amount of devekus and musar needs to come in. But if you spend all your energy building the warehouse and you never accumulate the wealth, then you have a beautiful empty warehouse. But a beautiful empty warehouse is not going to really give you anything. You see? This was his Yesod. And I have to say, so the emes is, many Hasidim were not makabel that type of idea because they thought, maybe they still think, that learning has a chashivas only if it either gives you practical halacha, which is a madrega of halacha l'maisa, Or alternatively, it directly deals with Devekus. So you're learning in Yonim of Devekus, Hashem, etc. But the kind of theoretical learning that was not Mekushar to a Devekus Hashem, they were Mezalzel. So the Nefesh HaChaim, part of why the Nefesh HaChaim was written was to emphasize the other way around. That, in fact, that is one reason why the Nefesh HaChaim, see, the Ruach Chaim is almost, in some ways, it's on the Mishnayos of Avos, but in some ways it's almost a kitzer of Nefesh HaChaim. Like virtually every single idea in Ruach Chaim has an arichos in Nefesh HaChaim. But one of the things a person notices when you learn Nefesh HaChaim is the huge amount of rayas that Rav Chaim brings in every Nakuda. Every Nakuda, even things that don't seem to be such a big chiddush, he'll bring like 20 rayas, and the rayas are mainly, they're from all of Chazal, of course, but mainly from the Zayir. He brings all the rayas from Kabbalah. And why is he bringing all these rayas from Kabbalah? Because Chasidus was miyusad on Kabbalah, so he wanted to B'dafka show that even al pi Kabbalah, you're making a mistake. Al pi Kabbalah, you have to understand the kayach of Dvekas in Teiras Hashem. Right, so here he is restating the idea that an Eitzar is vital for the preservation of the grain, but you don't put all your energy in building an Eitzar. Your energy has to be getting the grain. Yiras Hashem, he Eitzarei. So he says like this. He says, therefore, a person who is involved in learning can face 3 Yetzer Haras. Yetzer Hara number 1 is don't learn. Right? That's the Yetzer Hara of Taiva. Just go and have a good time, have fun. So that's Yetzer Hara number 1. Yetzer Hara number 2 is learn, but don't focus on Yiras Hashem. Meaning learn without the Musar, without the Yisairus. And number 3 is only focus on the Musar and don't focus on the learning. Right? So these are 3 different nisyanas. One is don't learn. The other is learn without the Eitzer. And the other is build the Eitzer without the learning. So he wants to say that the 3 teachings, though it's not going to be as neat as you would hope. The 3 teachings of the Anshe Knesset Agdela are keneged the 3 Yetzer Haras. But it's not going to be a 1, 2, 3 versus 1, 2, 3. It's actually, you'll see how he counts it. The way he counts it is the work doesn't work as well as we would hope. But this is what he says. He says the first Yetzer Hara of not learning, that is negated by have Mesunim Badin. In other words, to learn, to take your time, to understand Chlorkite. But he says that includes the second one as well. In other words, the Yetzer Hara not to learn is addressed by 2 of the teachings. To be Masun Badin, which is take your time to be Ma'ayin, and be Marbitz Torah to other people. In fact, Rav Chaim points out a very beautiful thing, and this is no question that this came from his experience as Rosh Yeshiva. He said, what is his Lashon? Let me find you the Lashon here. Hapeh hu ki etzba margish hapegima. Midei dabrei hapeh margish pegima saseicha. A sheichet shechs, right, shechs the neck of the animal with a very, very sharp knife. There cannot be any nick in the knife. Because if there's a small nick in the knife, that's going to, instead of just cutting the simanim, it's going to pull the simanim. And that's ikor, called ikor simanim, and that's a pasal shchita. So if you're a sheichet, one of the most important things is the knife has to be regularly checked for pegimas. Typically, a sheichet will have like one finger that has a long fingernail. You don't want to cut your finger. And he'll run his fingernail over the blade, and if it gets caught anywhere, that's a sign that it has to be sharpened, resharpened again. So Rav Chaim says, just like an etzpa, or tziparin really, is margish, the smallest pagam. In the second, peh, when you have to articulate your chidushim or your understandings, that'll be margish, you'll discover some type of defect in your logic. Meaning when you have to explain something, right? A person says often, I understand. I know. I know what Taisus is saying. So it says, tell me what Taisus is saying. You start saying it, you realize, I really don't see the connection between this and that. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik famously said, if you can't explain it even to a 9-year-old, although it'd be interesting to see how Rav Chaim would explain to Rav Chaim to a 9-year-old. He said, but he says, if you can't explain it, well, if you had a 9-year-old like Rav Chaim, probably Rav Chaim could explain it to a 9-year-old like Rav Chaim. But he says, if you can't explain it to a 9-year-old, you don't really understand it. And Rav Chaim Volozhiner is saying, therefore, Havi Masunim Badin and Hamidu Talmidim Harbe are both going to the clarity of your learning. It's not just a chiyuv of Harbatzas Torah, but the pshat is that I learn and I try to understand the best that I can, and then to ensure that my learning is right, when I have Talmidim, right, that's why Chazal say, you learn mi Talmidim Yesher Mikulam, because that is the test. Okay, so therefore that's Keneged, right, 1 and 2 are Keneged the first Yetzer Hara of not learning. Now, the third one, May Asu Siyag LaTorah, that's picking up both things. Make a fence for the Torah. So make a fence says you got to have the Yiras Hashem. But because it's a fence, be sure. So the way it works is 1 and 2 corresponds to Yetzer Hara number 1. Number 3 corresponds to Yetzer Hara number 2 and 3, meaning Siyag means you got to have the fence. La Torah means it should be a fence for the Torah and not just a Siyag. So it's not quite as symmetrical as you'd like. It would be nice, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Here it works. 1 is 2 and 3. 1 is 1 and 2, and 3 is 2 and 3. In other words, 2 of the Yetzer Haras are picked up in Asu, Siyag, La Torah. And again, this was the Shita. In fact, they say, Volozhin did not have a regular Musar Seder. Dafka, even after. So Volozhin, as you know, closed down. It was closed down by the Russian government in the 1890s. Why Volozhin closed down is a bit of a mystery to this very day. The official Kabbalah Messiah in the yeshiva world is that the Russian government demanded that they introduce a lot of secular subjects, and the Nitziv was machlit that it's better not to have a yeshiva than to have a yeshiva that's ma'uriv with limudei chol, and that is still used as a precedent against YU, against Lander, against any type of taruvas. Some say there was a different pshat. Volozhin was closed down because the Bachrim were rioting. The Nitziv wanted to make his son Rav Chaim, not Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, Rav Chaim Berlin, to be Rosh Yeshiva. The Bachrim wanted Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, and in Volozhin, they were very independent-minded Bachrim, and they would riot if the yeshiva didn't give them what they wanted. And the Russian government was very afraid of revolutionaries. Remember, the communist revolution will be in a few decades, and they just shut it down because this was a hotbed of revolutionary activity. So there's a machlokas yesh v'yesh why Volozhin closed down. But the emes says Volozhin did not have a regular Musar Seder. And it is said that even the Sefer Nefesh HaChaim, which Rav Chaim Volozhin wrote, the founder of the yeshiva, was not learned as a regular kaviyas in Volozhin because it was more than the 5 minutes per 15 hours. They said, forget it. L'shitas ha'machaber, we shouldn't be learning these foreign bi'arichas. But the Brisker Rav, so what happened was the last 12 years of Volozhin were really considered to be the golden age of Volozhin because the Nitziv, who had been Rosh Yeshiva for 50 years, you had the Nitziv, and then you had Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, Rav Chaim Brisker, who married the Nitziv's granddaughter. Rav Rafael Shapiro, very chashuv gadol, was the Nitziv's son-in-law, and Rav Chaim was the son-in-law of Rav Rafael Shapiro. So for those 12 years, imagine this, Rav Chaim was much younger than the Nitziv. You had the Nitziv, you had Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, and they had a very strange arrangement. They alternated giving shiur. And it's not that Rav Chaim had a shiur and the Nitziv had a shiur. They alternated. It was like a Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday versus Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So, and they had to cover a certain amount of ground. So there were times where if Chaim didn't have a particular chiddush, so he would literally just read 11 lines of Gemara because that's where the Nitziv was going to start the next time. Now, as you would expect, the Nitziv and Rav Chaim had very different drachim in learning. The Nitziv was a Meshunadik Baki, so when the Nitziv would give a shir, typically he would bring in Yushalmi, Toseftas, Midrashim, all sorts of sources from all over the place in order to be Mazrei Sugya, Meshunadik Bekias, with Havana, of course, but Meshunadik Bekias. Rav Chaim's Mahalach was not to bring in that much. Even you learn Rav Chaim. Rav Chaim does not bring so many other Makairis. Rav Chaim's point was the Iyun and a very deep Havana in the basic. He would just bring in a Rambam Ravid, a Taisus, whatever it would be. So it's interesting that some Bachrim only went to the Nitziv Shir and they skipped Rav Chaim's, and some only went to Rav Chaim's and they skipped the Nitziv. So I always think this is a real nechama to Rabbeim who give shiurim that people don't go to, because think about Volozhin. You had the Nitziv and you had Rav Chaim, and there were people who didn't go to either shir. I'm not talking about guys who weren't from. I mean, there were chashuvat people who said, I want to learn by myself. There were people who didn't go to any shir. See, Volozhin was very hefker. There was no Musar Seder, and you kind of made your own schedule. I mean, nobody forced you to do anything because the assumption was anyone who comes to Volozhin is already a chashuvat person. They don't need this. So some guys didn't go to shir. Some people didn't go to shir. Some people only went to Rav Chaim. Some people only went to the Nitziv, etc. Now, if you stayed in the shir, the interesting thing was you'd finish Shas in 11 years. So the official cycle in Volozhin was not just Yeshiva Shemesechtes. It was unique. Brachos to Nida. It wasn't Daf Yomi because 11 years, but it was a pace. And 11 years, you would have a Gans Shas under your belt. But a lot of people, either they didn't stay 11 years or they didn't go to the Shiurim. Some people skip. Rishu Zalman said. Rishu Zalman was a Talmud of both the Nitziv and Rav Chaim, but he was extremely close to Rav Chaim. That when they were learning Kachim in Volozhin, he skipped it. He said he wasn't ready for Kachim yet. He was young. He says he was still learning Nashim and Ezekiel. He skipped Kachim. He skipped all these Shiurim on Kachim. And he said his whole life he was nischaret, that he wasn't zeicher to hear. He wrote on Kachim later. The Even HaAzel is on. It's on the whole Rambam, including Kachim. So of course he was Isaac and Kachim later, but he said he missed hearing those shiurim on Kachim. Okay, but be it as it may, when Volozhin was closed down, the Brisker Rav was not yet bar mitzvah. I think he was 12 years old when Volozhin closed down, and Rav Chaim went to Brisk to take over from the Beis Levi. The Nitziv went to Minsk, but the Nitziv more or less died very shortly afterwards. They say it was mamish heartbreak. So the Nitziv was nifter within a year of Volozhin closing down. Rav Chaim lived for almost 20 years afterwards. He became the Rav of Brisk. But those who knew Rav Chaim from Volozhin, they say he was never the same. Rav Chaim was a Rav. He was a good Rav, a very great Rav, conscientious Rav. But they remember him in Volozhin as being Malei Simcha, always Malei Simcha. In Volozhin, as Rav of Brisk, he was more somber, more serious. And people who knew Rav Chaim from Volozhin, they said they couldn't imagine the difference in the personality, because it wasn't really his life's work. His life's work was to be a Rosh Yeshiva, and that in Brisk he didn't have the opportunity so much. But the Brisker Rav was 12 years old, and the Brisker Rav said that he understands that Min HaShamayim, Volozhin had to close because the Talmidim were not learning Musar, and therefore there was a great potential for there to be Makul Kolim. Because when Volozhin closed, that's when the other yeshivas became more prominent. Slobodka, Mir, and all of these yeshivas were great Musar yeshivas, where Musar was a chalik of the curriculum. And the Brisker Rav says, even though the Brisker Rav himself was not a fan of the Musar Seder, but whatever, sometimes there are steers in the Brisker Rav, but the Brisker Rav said that Min HaShamayim, it was necessary that the Masira of Torah should come through yeshivas that are Isaac and Musar and the like, because otherwise the kilkulim of gaiva and everything else are too strong. And in Voloshin, the taka was not a regular Musar Sefer later. So the Brisker Reb himself was Maida to the nechitzas of Musar. Okay, so that is the three things. Masunin Badin and Hamidu Talmim Harbe is connected the Yitzhak of not learning. Asu Siyag L'Taira is connected the two mistakes of concentrating too much on the warehouse or thinking you don't need the warehouse. You need the fence, but the fence has to be a fence around the Torah. That was the great Yesod, that the Torah has to be Iker. Now, I'll leave you with one kasha on this a little bit. Throughout, both here and the Nefesh Chaim, Rav Chaim always differentiates between, let's say, Musar or Yira. He actually doesn't use the word Musar. He uses the word Yira. Yira and Torah. And the question is, what does that mean exactly? So let's say he would be against my learning Musar all day. Well, why is that? I mean, let's say I learn a sefer like Mesilas Yesharim all day, or my morning sefer is Mesilas Yesharim. Now, Mesilas Yesharim brings Midrashim, it brings Chazal, meaning, what's the pshat? Don't spend your time on Musar, spend your Iker time on Torah. But why isn't the Musar itself Torah? What in Musar makes it? So I understand if the pshat would be, I'm only going to say Tehillim with Devekas and not be Ma'ayin in what I'm learning. So you could say that's Yira without Torah. But if you're learning a Sefer Musar that has an intellectual content, why can't, so to speak, why can't I kill two birds with one stone? I mean, the Iker is Torah, so that's my Torah too. My Torah is Torah Sayira. Sefer like Ali Shur, especially. Ali Shur is Molei V'Gadish with Makairis. Kuzari, right? So it seems that Rav Chaim had in mind that Torah is considered Torah only if it's in the Eimek of Inyanim of Halacha. That when it's Inyanim of Hashkafa, Inyanim of Yiras Hashem, even though that is coming from the same Makairis as the halachic sugyas, he seems to consider that not to be nichlal in limud HaTorah. So is that true with Agadata? I mean, what does he mean? So let's just, right? If I would ask Rav Chaim, I would like to. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I want to learn Ein Yaakov in the morning. So Rav Chaim would say to me, well, Yiras Hashem, he Eitzarai, but it's only the Eitzer. It can't be the Iker limud. I said, well, why not? It's learning. It's from Chazal. What? It's not just the Eitzer. In fact, it's the Eitzer plus the Tfuah. I don't have a Klar Yishuv. In other words, there seems to be a very narrow definition of what counts as learning. So he's not disparaging those other limudim, but he's classifying them as the Yira category, and the Yira category has to be smaller than the Torah category. The Torah has to be the Iker, and the Yira is the preservative. And even if you're not going to go with the 1 to 180 ratio, let's say our door needs more than that, but it still has to be a clear majority, has to be on the Torah side. So that's a little bit of a kasha, like Mehechi Tesi, that Torah Sayira. Now the Emes says, I'm wondering if Yisrael Salanter might, I mean, he's in the Messiah of Zundel of Salant. His Rebbe was a Talmud of Rav Chaim Volozhner. So Rav Yisrael Salanter is only 2 Dairis after Rav Chaim Volozhner, and their lives, in fact, overlapped. I mean, when Rav Yisrael was a young man, Rav Chaim Volozhner was still alive. But I'm wondering if Rav Yisrael Salanter might be chazak in this, because Rav Yisrael Salanter in his Shitas HaMusar would always emphasize that from the Musar, you have to be oimed on chidushim in halachos ben adam lechaveira. Meaning, his Talmud, Rav Yisrael's Talmud, Rav Itzel Petterberger, Vitzel of Petterberg, really Rav Itzel Blazer, was one of the great Baalei Musar. Writes, he put out the Ohr Somayach, Rav Yisrael Salanter's Sefer, really came out from Itzel Petterberg. He wrote a Hakdama, he wrote stories. He was Maasif letters of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. So he writes there in the Hakdama that Rav Yisrael Salanter was mechadesh many chidushim in chesed mishpat ben adam l'chaverei based on the hasagas of Musar, meaning he took the Musar and he would try to apply it b'dafka in the lamdas of halacha l'maisa. So I'm wondering if you're approaching Musar that way, it maybe Rav Chaim Volozhner would be Maida. So it's not just Torah Sayira, it becomes Hilchais Bein Adam L'Chavera. It becomes a limud. I mean, if I'm learning Chesed Mishpat, that would presumably qualify as Torah. So if I'll be Musar, I'm trying to be Maitzi, new halachais in Bein Adam L'Chavera. See, again, I'm just thinking out loud. The dichotomy between Torah and Yira is not such a clear dichotomy because many inyanim of Yira become halachas psukes. You know, the Chafetz Chaim, when he wrote the Sefer Chafetz Chaim on Hilchos Lashon Hara, so whole Sefer on Hilchos Lashon Hara. I don't mean Shmiras HaLashon is Musar, but Chafetz Chaim is a Sefer of halacha, Piskei halacha. So he writes in the Hakdama like this. He says, people may taina on me that many of my maskanas come from Sharei Tshuva of Rabbeinu Yaina. And that's a Musar Sefer, and it's not a halacha Sefer. So how can I be Maitzi halachais from Sharei Tshuva of Rabbeinu Yaina, the Chafetz Chaim Bevarn? You actually see the Litvische discrimination against Sifrei Musar. The Chafetz Chaim has to fanfare. The Chafetz Chaim has to answer it, right? Because what's your Sefer? What are you doing? And his teretz was Taka, that anything from the Rishonim is always going to be a makar of halacha. He says that the idea that Musar versus halacha, maybe in Achronim there may be such a thing, right? Somebody writes Musar Shmuzim, whatever it is, but when the Rishonim are telling you how you have to behave in your life, it's always coming mitaych the halacha itself. And therefore the Chafetz Chaim held he could be Maitzi halacha l'maisa from Sifrei Musar of the Rishonim. Shari Tshuva is from the Rishonim. So what I'm saying is Rav Yisrael was kind of, in his own hanhagas, was following like Rabbeinu Yaina, meaning he was using these inyanim of Musar to be Maitzi halacha l'maisa. So that's something to think about exactly. Like what is Rav Chaim's core definition of what is called Torah, what is called Yira. But be it as it may, whatever is called Yira has to be the Eitzer and not the Ikar. The Ikar is to be Machnes, the Torah. Okay. So after the Anshe Knesset Agdaila's three things, we're going to go in order. The Dairis, who were the Ikar Makabalei Torah Shabal Peh, and it's going to go all the way up to Rebbe, who's the author of the Mishnah. Right? So we'll go from the Anshe Knesset Agdaila down to Rebbe, and even a few generations after Rebbe as well. So the next one is Shimon HaTzadik, right? We have a connection to Shimon HaTzadik, our streets, and the kever of Shimon HaTzadik is down the street. I'm not sure, on those who don't go to Meiron on Lag BaOmer, they have a minhag of doing upsharons or by Shimon HaTzadik. I'm not sure what the Sheicha says. Shimon HaTzadik was a great tzaddik, but it's just a Gzeira Shava. Shimon HaTzadik has no Sheichas to Lag BaOmer per se, so I'm not sure why Lag BaOmer people say they go to the kever of Shimon HaTzadik. Maybe it's a mistaken identity, but Shimon HaTzadik we know a little bit about. According to the Rambam, he was the Kohen Gadol at the beginning of the Bayis Sheni after Ezra, and Ezra succeeded Yoshua ben Yotzadok, whose children unfortunately married Goyim and the like. And Shimon HaTzadik lived at the very, very end of the period of Tanakh. That's why it's a new Tekufa, because Tanakh ends with the Persian rule over Eretz Yisrael. Right, the last Persian king that's mentioned is Daryavesh Hasheni, who's actually, Chazal say, is the son of Achashverosh and Esther. And Daryavesh Hasheni is the Persian king who allowed the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. The second Beis HaMikdash was started in the second year of Daryavesh ben Esther, shortly after the Purim story, and it was finished in the 6th year of Daryavesh ben Esther. And when we say it lasted 420, we're actually counting from the second year, not the sixth year. So from the time it was completed, it was not 420, it was only 416 years. The 420 is Kailel, the start of the binyan. So Shimon now, what happens at that point? So Tanakh ends. Tanakh essentially ends with the building a few years, the first few years of the Bayis Sheni, and that's the end. Now, what happened after the period of Tanakh is the conquest of Persia by Alexander of Macedonia, called Alexander the Great, although we don't consider him great, but that's how history knows him. And Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, and by conquering the Persian Empire, he automatically conquered Eretz Yisrael. So this was not a war. Alexander did not wage war against Eretz Yisrael. He conquered the Persian Empire. Mela, he conquered Eretz Yisrael, and that is when the Tekufa of Yavan begins. We had Bavel, Paras, now this is Tekufa of Yavan, and around 100 years later we have Antiochus after Alexander dies, etc. Right, that's the Greek period that then becomes the Roman period. So Shimon HaTzadik is at the time of Alexander of Macedonia, when the Yavanim conquered Persia and Memela conquered Eretz Yisrael. Now, Alexander is an interesting guy. Alexander died very young. Alexander died at 31, perhaps through a plague, perhaps through assassination, because he had a huge world empire. And perhaps, well, the legend, the Baba Maisa has it that he died out of grief because he said he had no more worlds to conquer. He conquered the whole world. What else will he do with the rest of his life? Alexander had a young baby, and that baby mysteriously died shortly after Alexander. That was almost certainly poisoned because then you get into all the machlokesim among the generals, and that's how Antiochus gets into the picture after the death of Alexander. And just to show you though, if you have money, you can get anything. Alexander's father was Philip of Macedonia. Macedonia is a little country, and Philip was king of Macedonia. And Alexander eventually became king of Greece and king of everything. But he was raised in a royal house. He was raised by Philip of Macedonia. And Philip of Macedonia wanted his son to have a good education in everything, in sports, in military, and even in science. So who did he get to be the teacher of little Alexander? He got Aristotle. Aristotle, the greatest, most famous Greek philosopher in the world. The Rambam writes later about Aristotle that he reached the highest madrega of Chachma, short of Nevuah. Something. So Philip hires him, right? Philip hires him to teach his kid. He must have gotten a lot of money. I mean, it must have been a pretty high. It's like saying, you have a 10-year-old, you want to hire Rav Chaim Kanievsky to kind of be his tutor. I mean, Lahavdil, infinite Havdalas. But literally, Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander, and so the Gemara in Yuma gives a very, very fascinating story about the encounter of Alexander and Shimon HaTzadik. After Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire, so there were enemies of the Jews that said, oh, the Jews are using the Beis HaMikdash, they were Malshin, as a base to organize a rebellion against you. So it's brought that Alexander came to Jerusalem with an army prepared to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. Because the Jews are rebelling, they're using the Mikdash as a fortress. Shimon HaTzadik was the Kohen Gadol. And he came out with all his big kahunas. So Shaila, how was he allowed to wear big kahunas? It's machlekes the Rambam and the Ravid, because big kahuna have shatnez in them. So why was he allowed to do it? Is the Rishonim discuss. Either he held it was pikuach nefesh, or like some Rishonim, by big kahuna, shatnez is legamri mutter, even shlo b'shas havayda. So there are two ways of learning. But he comes out to be mavakesh rachamim, and Alexander sees Shimon HaTzadik, and Alexander gets off his horse. In Greek mythology, Alexander's horse is very famous too, but he gets off the horse. He bows down, and he says, you are the face, you are the man that I see every time I go out to Milchama, you tell me if I'll be Minatseach or not. Hashem sent Shimon HaTzadik to be the Shaliach. And because he was makir the godless of Shimon HaTzadik, he spared Yerushalayim. He didn't destroy, Alexander didn't destroy the Mikdash. And it is said that year, every Jewish baby that was born was given the name Alexander. Every Jewish boy that was born was given the name Alexander. And that is why Alexander is called the Shem Kodesh. You can be called to the Torah with Alexander. Even though Alexander is Greek, Alexander is not a Hebrew name, but Chazal kind of admitted it into the Shemos of Kodesh, Lezecher, that particular event. Right? So persons can be called to the Torah, Alexander, whatever. So this is a very beautiful story of Shimon HaTzadik and Alexander right after the end of Tanakh. This is after, right? Alexander is right after Tanakh. There's no mention of Alexander or the Greek conquest in Tanakh. Now, on Yom Kippur, after when we do the Seder Avodah, so afterwards we talk about how beautiful was the face of the Kohen Gadol when he went out, right? Man Nadar Kohen Gadol. It's even set to music. Marek Hayin, the beautiful. And the truth is, the piyut is much longer than we have it. Machzorim over time cut things down, because if you notice, it starts off as an aleph page. It only goes like aleph to dalet, and then it does shin to taf. You just look at it, you'll see, which means it's part of a much longer thing that went through the whole aleph base, describing the beauty, the ruchniistic beauty, the holiness, like the Shemayim, etc. So the emes is the makor of that piyut is from a description that was written about Shimon HaTzadik leaving the Kodesh HaKodashim. It's very interesting because the emes is most of the Kohanim Gedolim of the Bayis Sheni were not tzaddikim. In fact, most of them died. Now, most of them didn't live a whole year, but it doesn't mean they died in the Kodesh HaKodashim. That's a bit of a mistake. They didn't die in the Kodesh HaKodashim. But if they went into the Kodesh HaKodashim and they were not worthy, they died in the course of the year. So not that they... Now, the Zohar may be chaylik in that. The Zohar actually says the famous statement that they tied a rope to the leg of the Kohen Gadol, so if he didn't come out after a while, they could pull him out. So the Zohar Vaisdechais does seem to learn that Kohanim Gedolim died in the Kodesh HaKodashim. So after that is the Zohar's position, but the Bavli does not say that. The Bavli never says that Kohanim Gedolim died in the Kodesh HaKodashim. That would have been a desecration. It just says the Kohen Gadol was not Maitzi Shnasei. So for most of the Kohanim Gedolim, to have this beautiful description of the holiness of his panim probably was not the case. So I'm telling you that the original makar of this is what someone wrote about Shimon HaTzadik when he went out of the Kodesh HaKodashim. And indeed, the Gemara in Yuma tells us there were many, many miracles in the lifetime of Shimon HaTzadik. The idea of Ner Tamid, the idea that there was one candle of the menorah that never went out. That was Bimei Shimon HaTzadik. After Shimon HaTzadik, we were not zeichet to that miracle. We had to light everything all the time. Bisman Shimon HaTzadik, there was a Ner Tamid. And by the way, even that people misunderstand. Ner Tamid does not mean it never went out. Fakert, you have to light the menorah every day. And that means you have to light 7 neiros. It means it never went out by itself, meaning that even after all the candles burnt out, this ner never went out, and Einochinami, we then had to blow it out, fill it up with new oil, and relight it. Even Hanukkah is that way. Now Hanukkah, the ner tamid was not just one ner; it burned for 8 days. But you have to understand, it doesn't mean they let it burn for 8 days. Fakert, there's a mitzvah of hadlakas hamenayra every single day. So what it means is every single day they blow out the candles. But there was a nace that one day of Shemen didn't go down, so they could relight it every day. People don't understand that, right? Everybody thinks the Hanukkah miracle is it just burnt for 8 days, and they think the Ner Tamid is one candle, never went out. It had to go out. It had to go out because there was a chiyuv of Adlakas Menorah but it never went out by itself. And with Hanukkah too, they had to blow it out and light. So Shimon HaTzadik was very, very great. And what we say on Yom Kippur is really a shvach of potentially what a Kohen Gadol could have, but it was actualized only in Shimon HaTzadik. So the Mishnah says, okay, I'll just begin it. We'll leave it for next week. The Mishnah says he was Mishayare Knesset Hagdela. He was, I had said he was the last member. You don't really have a raya. It says he was of the leftover, the remainder, meaning among the last. It's not clear that it was Mamish the last. And he said a very famous statement that everybody knows, one of the most famous Mishnayos in Shas, in Pirkei Avos, and that is Al Shleisha Devarim Ha'elam Aimed. The world stands on three pillars, meaning without these pillars, the world is going to collapse. It can't have a kiyum. The world cannot endure without three yesodais that are in the Bria, and this is Ala Torah, V'Ala Veda, V'Agamilas Chasadim. It will be Marich in this next week, Amir Hashem. Alimud HaTorah, Aveda is Korbanos, or Tefillah, or Tefillah, and Gemilas Chasadim is the kindness that we show Bein Adam L'Chaverei. It's a very well-known idea. Rav Chaim doesn't even say it. It's just a well-known idea generally that this is connected the Avos HaKadoshim, although in somewhat of a different order, and that is Avraham Avinu. His Ikar Aveda was Gemilas Chesed. Yitzchak, who was willing to be a Korban, is the Omid of Aveda. And Yaakov, who spent 14 years in Yeshivat Shem B'Ever without sleeping, represents the concept of Torah. And indeed, according to the Yerushalmi, the order is different. Yitzchak says, Gemilas Chasadim, Aveda v'Torah. Instead of Torah, Aveda, Gemilas Chasadim, it says Gemilas Chasadim, Aveda, Torah. So the Mefarshim say that the Yerushalmi is referring to the order of the revelation. Avraham is Chesed, Yitzchak is Aveda, Yaakov is Torah. So if you look at the Avos, it's Gemilas Chasadim, Aveda, Torah. But the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos is not looking at it mitzad the Avos, it's looking at it mitzad the importance. And Torah is number one, meaning Yuvadai needs all three. And this is important. The Gemara in Yevamos says, Kol ha'omer ein li ela Torah, afilu Torah ein bei. Anybody who says, all I need is Torah, he doesn't have Torah either. You need all three. Torah, Aveda, Gemilas Chasadim. But even though you need all three, Torah is the most important of the three. And the reason is, as the Gemara says in Kedushin, Gadol Talmud, learning is great, Shemevi lidei Maisa. Learning will bring you to Maisa. Maisa will not bring you to learning. How does that work? When I learn, so I know what I have to do. So I learn, that'll bring me to Maisa. Maisa, I can do all the Maisa I want, which are wonderful. But that's not going to give me pshat in the K'tzais. That's not going to give me pshat in Rebbe Kiva Eger. So Torah, and here Rav Chaim does say that, says the reason why Torah is the Yikr, well, he gives a few reasons. Number one, Torah is the Yikr because Torah is makasher your whole mitzvahs to Hashem, meaning every mitzvah. The mitzvahs themselves are mechuvin to the Eivarim and the Gidim. Now, we don't know exactly how that is, but every mitzvah saseh is keneged a bone. Every mitzvah shleisase is keneged a sinew or a ligament. So your devekus is via whatever it would be. I do a certain mitzvah, so I'm davuk b'Hashem by this finger or that finger, right? That's my connection. Torah is makasher the whole mitzias of a person. So Torah itself is a greater hiskashrus. By the way, the Baal Tanya says that as well. This is why the Tanya was criticized, not by Misnagdim, it was criticized by Hasidim, because the Baal Tanya B'davka emphasizes the comprehensive devekus of Talmud Torah. But that's one reason. And the other reason why Torah is Iker is because Torah is Mevi Lidei Maisa. From Torah you'll come to Maisa. From Maisa you will not come to Torah. So on one hand, it is important. It is important to emphasize. I know in yeshiva, we talk learn, and and we sometimes may ignore the other two. So it's important not to ignore the other two. The other two are amudim. The world cannot stand only on Torah. If it's a Torah does not lead to Avaida and Gemilas Chasadim, then the Torah itself is not doing anything. But of the three amudim, Torah will give you everything else, or can bring you to everything else. Masha Ein Kain, the other things you're not going to do it. The Chavetz Chaim used to say, I'll just end with this, that this is why the Sarei Shel Esav, which represents the Kayach Hara, the Sitra Achra, only attacks Yaakov. Remember, Yaakov is attacked by the Sarei Shel Esav. Why don't you find a similar attack of the Satan to Avraham and Yitzchak? So he says like this. He says, Avraham represents the power of Chesed, and Yitzchak represents the power of Abaida. So the idea is the Sitra Achra is happy to let Yidden do mitzvahs as long as it's pretty sure there's not going to be a kiyum. It's not a continue. I'll let you have your short-term stuff. It's not going to last. But the Sitra Achra is going to be misnaged to anything that can have a kiyum forever. So when Avram is Isaac in Chesed, so the Sitra Achra says, let Yidden do Chesed. Fine, let them do Chesed. Doesn't bother me. That's going to peter out eventually. Avodah, let them have their beautiful synagogues. With Yaakov, there's Nitzchias. Once there's Nitzchias, that the Sitra Achra has to fight. So the truth is, the Chavetz Chaim was not talking about American Jewish history, but it actually does fit if you know about American Jewish history, and that is the first Jewish immigrants to America were largely Germans who were Reformed, not that many Orthodox. And they became very wealthy. A lot of Lehman Brothers, a lot of the big investment banking houses were founded by assimilated Reform Jews. Now, they were very assimilated. Some of them even converted to Christianity, not because they believed in it. I mean, they weren't religious. They didn't believe in anything. They just, if you're a Christian, you're more likely to get ahead. So these were conversions for convenience. So what was their thing? They created a lot of chesed organizations. They created Jewish hospitals. Now, today you don't really need, in Chutz La'aretz, you don't need a Jewish hospital per se. I mean, they're not religious, not like Shari Tzedek, but there were, in those days, in the 1800s, Jews sometimes couldn't get into a hospital. So they created Jewish hospitals. They created country clubs. I don't know if that calls Gemilas Chasadim, but there was social fraternization. They created burial societies. In other words, their Iker Asik was Gemilas Chasadim. What happened to them? Most of their kids, grandkids, great-grandkids aren't even Jewish anymore. They're Avar Ubatel Mina Eilam. Not even Jewish, not even Yidden. Now, the next generation came in the late 1800s after a bunch of pogroms in Russia. In the 1890s, there were a lot of pogroms and many, many Yidden were killed. And many Jews came over, and they were Russian, Polish Jews. They were poor. They were taka poor. And indeed, the German Jews didn't like the Polish Jews that much because the Polish Jews were a little embarrassing. The German Jews were dressed well and well educated. The Polish Jews, perhaps they were educated in Torah, perhaps not. Not all of them were learned either, but they certainly were not educated in secular sense. So what did the Polish Jews do? A lot of them were from, but they invested their energies not in creating yeshivas, but in creating batei knesiyos. And they did some very magnificent shuls. I remember the shuls of my youth. They don't make shuls like that anymore. Stained glass windows, beautiful, beautiful batei knesiyos. And what happened with their kids? Well, because there were no yeshivas, a lot of the kids of Yidden, Polish Yidden, who were Shomer Shabbos, also not from, intermarried, disappeared. They disappeared. So the Chavetz Chaim is saying this. When your Yiddishkeit is based on Gemilas Chasadim, people disappear. Havaida, even, people disappear. When it comes to what happened after, so the third wave is after World War II. After World War II, many Gedalim came over, Rav Aaron Kotler, and you had a man, Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, who created day school networks all over the United States. Ad Kedei Kach, that there's not a city with 500 Jews that doesn't have some religious day school. Yeah, some of them are co-ed, whatever it is. That is a much bigger issue here. In other words, the notion of chinuch, yeshivos, kailalim, day schools, that is really a post-World War II project. Now, it's still the case. Most Jews in America are not from, okay, Beseder, but certainly the Yiddishkeit and the vibrancy is very, very strong. Many, many, many people are Shomer Torah mitzvahs. And that's what the Chaim is saying. When you create a Yesod based on Torah, there is what is called intergenerational continuity. There is nitzchias. And that's why the Sarei Shel Esav, Bedafka, wanted to destroy Yaakov, because Yaakov represented the Koyach of Torah. And that is maybe yet another reason why Torah is considered to be the number one of the three, because Torah is nimshach to the next generation, as opposed to everything else. Everything else is good, but it doesn't have a koyach that will go to the next generation. As I say, in American Jewish history, we've seen this. Baruch Hashem, that's not, we have Eretz Yisrael has many problems. That's not a problem we have in Eretz Yisrael. But the notion, anyone, maybe you're too young to know this, but maybe you remember, but the idea of changing neighborhoods and synagogues being sold to churches, which is Keneged Halacha, but it was done. You can see, go to any inner city. Well, not any, but many inner cities in the United States, New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Hartford, Connecticut. I mean, it's not a big city, but it's where I grew up. You will see magnificent churches, which are shuls. They still have the Aseres HaDibros in Hebrew. They still have, and these were magnificent Batei Knesset. And Rahman al-Islam, they're now churches. There's absolutely no heter at all to sell a shul to a church. And they develop some types of shtick, but this is clearly Shalai Baratzon Chachamim. But what do? You know, who else is going to buy a shul? They tell us, in my own shul that I grew up in, which was not as magnificent already, it was already in this Katnu Hadayret, but from the time the shul was built till the time that the shul closed and was sold to a church was less than 15 years for sure. Less than 15 years for sure. They made a massive miscalculation. They moved out of a bad neighborhood to another neighborhood, and that neighborhood became this kalkel in less than 20 years for sure. I mean, I remember I remember when the shul was dedicated, and I remember when the shul was closed, right? So that's was life in America. But again, if it's just Avodah without Torah, then there's going to be all of these kilkulim that are happening. In fact, they tell it, it's not a joke. It's that when a shul was being dedicated, so one of the people in the audience was a black minister. So, I mean, nobody invited him, so somebody just asked him, why are you here? It's kind of rude, but why are you here? He said, I just want to see where my church is moving to in 20 years. I want to check out the building. The truth is, sadly, that's not far from the truth.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.